Good morning. Thank everybody for coming. Just to give a quick orientation as to how the press conference will go this morning. I want to just make a short preliminary statement. Foundation Counsel Rita Dave, to my right, will flesh out some of the specifics as to the Foundation's work in this case. It'll be followed by Paul Roncallo, retired fire marshal, was an expert in was an arson expert who played a critical role in this case. And last, we'll have our man of the hour, Mr. William Haughey, who will speak to his own experience. So, briefly, when I started the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice before, it was almost like 4 years ago, my dream was to help exonerate people who were wrongfully convicted in the same position that I was, recalling that I served 16 years in prison for a murder and rape which I did not commit, which DNA proved that I didn't commit. The Foundation's attitude in terms of fighting wrongful convictions has always been and will always be, we do whatever is necessary. If that means doing a case completely in-house, from soup to nuts, on the investigative and legal level, then that's what we do. If it's instead just simply an investigatory role, as happened in the William Lopez exoneration, where Mr. Lopez had pre-existing counsel, then that's what we'll do. If a client has a lawyer, we will work with that lawyer if they're open to do that. If the assistance is simply on a public relational level, in terms of keeping the case alive in the media, which often is as important to correcting injustices as is what happened inside the courtroom, if it's on the level of encouraging people to attend post-conviction hearings so that the judges can see that the claimant has supporters who believe in their innocence, for the visual impact of that, then that's what we do. I don't believe that the correct attitude is to only assist people if they have no help at all whatsoever. This is about trying to help people regain their freedom, which is a very dramatic thing to lose. And so just like it takes a total team effort in terms of all the different levels and failings of the system, on the police level, on the prosecutorial level, sometimes on the judicial level, on the level of the jury, on the level of the appellate courts, just as there's those breakdowns at all those various junctures that culminate into a wrongful conviction and preservation of same. It's a total effort to exonerate people, and so the Foundation will always be ready to assist in whatever capacity is needed. Foundation Counsel Rita Dave, in just a second, will outline the specifics as to what our role here was in this case. It was substantial, but she'll speak to that. I want to thank Mr. Ted Green, who is Mr. Haughey's habeas attorney. He didn't have an ego. He was willing to collaborate with us. We ran our investigation parallel to efforts on the habeas level. We got substantial cooperation from the Putnam DA, but again, Mr. Dave will speak to the specifics of that. Can you please give out the specifics, to flesh it out in terms of our efforts which culminated in today?
Hi, everybody. So the Foundation, over the last 3 years, when we first received the letter from Bill, started to look into the case. We read the trial transcripts, we went through some of the police reports, and realized the non-existent level of evidence that put him in prison. So having done that, we started working with two arson experts, Mr. Paul Roncallo and Bill Tullipane, and after that we started embarking on having meetings and showing the level of actual innocence on Haughey's part, on Mr. Haughey's part, in dealing with the district attorney's office, which at that time was the office of District Attorney Levy. We then worked on putting a 440 motion together to create his exoneration. And over the last 7 months, I have worked extensively with the now District Attorney, Robert Tendy of Putnam County, who is really a very simple, straightforward man who's looking for justice. And with him, jointly, we went over the file, we went over the transcripts, the lack of evidence. As Mr. Tendy submitted this case to his newly formed conviction review unit, which consisted of investigators as well as 2 attorneys who've been on both sides of the law, prosecution and defense, the Putnam County's counsel, the Attorney General's office, also retained their own expert. And so that expert had initially been retained under D.A. Levy's administration and had carried over. And that third expert review by Mr. Toscano also mirrored, supported, and substantiated the original reports by Mr. Roncallo and Tulipane that this in fact was not an arson, that in fact Mr. Haughey was not responsible for it, that there was evidence that had been destroyed, that there was no investigation until 13 hours after a fire. The origin of the fire was not even properly established. So ultimately, Mr. Haughey's cries of innocence were being substantiated as well by the AG's office and the Putnam County District Attorney's office. And with that 7 months of continuous back and forth, the DA then took a stance that he wanted to not only set aside this conviction, but he wanted to have the indictment dismissed. And with the joint efforts of ourselves, myself, Mr. Tendy, Ted Green, who was counsel on the federal side for Mr. Haughey, we were able to ultimately secure a release and relief for Bill Haughey.
Could you just flesh out a little bit more in terms of the investigatory aspect?
Well, in addition to...
Because it's not just that we went back and forth with the DA, there was additional efforts beyond.
No, of course.
But please
Want to
share.
do that? Because you
No, I'd prefer you to share. No.
In addition to doing the investigations as far as the fire was concerned, we also needed to be in a position to find out exactly what steps were taken, what documents had been missing. We had, of course, prepared the 440 motion. We had been working with, on the expert side, doing more investigation in terms of the location, the actual underpinnings of how a fire occurs, going through the manuals. So there was a lot of underlying investigatory work that had to be conducted. We also then realized in doing some of our investigation that the location where this fire occurred had prior electrical fires. There were prior lawsuits involving fires. And so this was not just a happenstance, this was more likely a repeat occurrence of an electrical fire. But in this instance, the man who tried to put out the fire is the man who actually got accused of it, sent to jail, and then lost 8 years and 4 months of his life.
Thank you. This time I'd like to ask Mr. Paul Roncallo just to make a brief statement.
First and foremost, I want you to understand that we wouldn't even be here today if it weren't for the late Robert McMahon, who was head of Putnam County's Emergency Services. He was getting some letters from Bill, and after a couple of letters, he became suspicious as to the nature of the fire, and he asked me to take a look at it. I regret that my fellow investigator, Bill Tulipane, couldn't be here today. He was very instrumental in helping us come to the conclusions as to what happened.
Okay, I'd like to ask the man of the hour. Really, much more than that, there isn't really enough accolades really to throw on him. To, as courts have said, for an innocent person, even 1 day in prison is too much and is cruel and unusual punishment. like to acknowledge that Mr. Haughey endured 365 days. And then he repeated that 8 years, and then 4 months. I want to just understand the human consequences of that, but he survived. He was extremely proactive in seeking his exoneration. He has a great attitude, very jovial for someone to have been through the traumatic experience that he did. And I have to say, just standing next to him, I feel inspired just to be next to another exoneree, but not just any exoneree, but wanted the foundation help to exonerate. It is a reaffirmation for me that launching the foundation, that this was the right thing to do. It's kind of emotional, I guess. I mean, I've kind of been here before myself. Other than my own exoneration and later with Mr. Lopez, this is definitely one of the best moments of my life, without a doubt. Wrongful convictions are not rare. I wish that they were. Last year, 149 people were exonerated. The year before that, 139 were. 91 people were exonerated both in 2012 and 2013. Wayne State University study estimated that 10,000 new people were wrongfully convicted each year. There's a lot more that still remain behind, and so while we definitely want to take a moment and rejoice at Mr. Haughey's exoneration, we also want to level it off a little bit, in an acknowledgement of the many people that are in the position that both Bill and I were in before.
Good morning, everyone. I thank you all for coming. I really want to give big thanks to Jeff and his foundation. Without him and his foundation, I would not be here. And Ms. Rita Davi and Mr. Paul Roncawa, who have been instrumental in this whole entire thing. As Mr. Roncawa pointed out, I would like to thank personally Mr. Robert McMahon, the late Robert McMahon, the former Commissioner of Putnam County Emergency Services, for actually looking into this thing and seeing that there was some serious problems with this case and asking him to look into it. I would also like to commend Mr. Robert Tendy for his honesty, his integrity, for restoring said integrity to the District Attorney's Office. He's definitely a very, very, very good man. And I really just want to thank everyone for all of their help. It's been a long road. All right. As far as the facts of the case, the stipulation that was put out, that was signed by both my federal attorney, Mr. Theodore Green, and Mr. Robert Tendy, district attorney, it lays out the facts pretty well. Anything further than that will be discussed at a later date. I thank you all.
Maybe the last point I want to make, and then we'll open for questions if there are any. I think it's important that each exoneration is a learning moment, of the deficiencies that lead to wrongful convictions. It's critical that legislation be passed in order to improve the accuracy of the justice system. As great as it is to help exonerate Mr. Haughey, I would much rather that he have remained somebody totally unknown to me because he had never been wrongfully convicted. We need to pass a commission on prosecutor conduct. There's a bill right now pending in New York State Legislature, Senate Bill 24, Assembly 1131, which would create an oversight board for prosecutors. Let's just say in this particular matter that not all holders of the office of prosecutor and district attorney have acted quite so honorable in this particular case. And in many of the wrongful conviction cases, it doesn't make sense to me that there's no oversight board, there's no deterrent, there's nothing to punish. We need to videotape interrogations to prevent wrongful convictions caused by coerced false confessions. We need ID reform. We need a better system of public defense. So it's critical to get some legislation passed to prevent that. I again call on the New York State Legislature to finally pass something for the governor to throw his weight of his office into some of these measures. How many more wrongful convictions is it going to take before we finally can get some legislation passed in order to prevent wrongful convictions from happening? It's very hard for defendants of scant resources to find entities that are willing to take on their cases pro bono, because this typically happens to people without resources. They can't afford to hire their own attorneys, their own investigators. The foundation's a modest outfit. We have a big backlog. There's not enough organizations in the field to do this work. A lot of them are only doing DNA cases, which this is not a DNA case. As an example, we do both. But even the ones that do, there's a huge backlog, and so you throw the burden of proof into a defendant of scant resources. Find a lawyer who will work your case for free. Find an investigator who will work your case for free. Find an expert, if that's what the case takes, who will take your case for free. And then that new team, let them go out and try to prove a negative. Let them go out and try to prove that you didn't commit a crime. The odds are tremendous against you. As much time as Mr. Haughey and myself and others have done, in a lot of ways we're the lucky ones because we made it out. There's many people who will never make it out. There's not enough help. That's why it's critical to prevent wrongful convictions from happening in the first place. At this time, if anybody has any questions, this would be the time to ask. Jonathan?
Mr. Tendy said yesterday that he didn't think there was anything egregious about this, that he didn't think there was anything intentional, that there was a series of unfortunate events that led to your conviction. Do you share that?
Can you go to the mic, please?
Oh, sorry. I can't put my finger on anything specific. We're still fleshing out the facts of everything. A lot of new material is still coming out, so I'll leave that comment for later on.
What have you been, you got out on bail about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. What have you been doing since then? Your plans for now?
On May 9th, the federal magistrate judge, on request from Mr. Robert Tendy, the district attorney for Putnam County, after he conceded that there was a compelling showing of actual innocence by clear and convincing evidence, requested release on own recognizance. And since that time, I've just been trying to catch up on the things I've missed. Just the little things that most people take for granted.
Let me just add that.
Include your walks.
No, but let me also add that, while the specifics will be, fleshed out later in the court, not everybody did everything proper at all stages. So that'll be fleshed out later. But, does anyone else have any other?
Bill, how did you come to be, how were you identified as a suspect to begin with?
That's the million-dollar question. There's still been conflicting stories on that since the beginning. Every time it seems to change.
There was a video that showed Bill in the bar along with a bunch of other people. He was the one that, after the smoke was seen in an area away from where Bill actually ultimately went to look at, the flames were coming out of a different location. That point of origin was never properly identified. That was one problem. But the video clearly shows that everybody was sort of running around trying to figure out, where did this smoke come from, where was this fire coming from, and ultimately they decided to look in the bathroom. And it was Bill who took the impetus to climb up, pull down one of the tiles. There was burning paper or whatever, which they pulled down.